and some of the changes that was bringing to America's cities, the way that Americans were responding to those changes in immigration, and how that was just overall changing the whole political fabric, really. All right, so we know it's interesting that what we're seeing here are really some very similar phenomena that we saw happening in the years prior to the Civil War. You know, we saw that first wave of industrialization happening in the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, and it coincided with a massive wave of immigration that took place then in the first half of the 19th century. And we see essentially the same thing kind of happening again. For lack of a better phrase, history kind of repeating itself, although a little bit differently and on a much larger scale. So between around probably 1860 or so, and really reaching its peak in the 1870s and 80s, we're seeing another massive migration, or immigration rather, of new immigrants to the United States. And so, because immigration had kind of slacked off during the Civil War years, there have been multiple things that had prevented a lot of immigration from taking place. But once the Civil War is over, you know, all of those issues kind of aren't there anymore. All those roadblocks aren't really there anymore. And so we see this massive influx of immigrants, into which eventually by the turn of the century or so, or maybe a little bit before that, something like, you know, maybe 1 in 10 or something, I think it's actually less than that, of Americans were foreign born. So it gets to where a huge portion of the population in this period actually was made up of immigrants, immigrating from mostly, of course, Europe. We're going to talk about which areas of Europe in a moment. Now, as far as why these immigrants are coming, it's some of the same reasons we've talked about before. What do you suppose are some reasons or some factors that might have motivated this massive wave of immigration to the United States at this point? Job opportunities, yeah. That this is a time where the United States, of course, is industrializing on a massive scale. So there seem to be job opportunities and, you know, economic opportunity overall in the United States as opposed to a lot of the countries where these people were coming from. What else might motivate people besides economic opportunity? What now? Religion, yes. These are oftentimes, as we're going to see, people that were persecuted religiously in their home countries. And so they saw the United States as a place to escape that. We'll talk about some specific groups here in a moment. What else besides religious persecution? Yeah?
Like I said, like even
yes.
Like refugees from war-torn countries.
Yes. Fleeing violence, fleeing political persecution, fleeing other kinds of chaos in their home countries. And famine and things like that were prevalent in certain parts of Europe at this time. And so those are particularly some of the groups that are going to be attracted to the United States at this point. Again, I think it's somewhere between 1 in 7 or 1 in 10 Americans will be foreign born by the 20th century. Now, we call this group of immigrants that immigrates in the 1870s, 1880s. They oftentimes get referred to as the new immigrants, okay? Contrasting them from the old immigrants, which would be referring to that massive wave of immigration that took place prior to the Civil War. So these are the new immigrants that are coming over in the late 19th century, that to many people seemed very different, and many would even say stranger, and they were even more concerned about these immigrants, and oftentimes might get nostalgic or long for what they called the old immigrants. So let's talk about some of the some of the characteristics of these new immigrants. Now, if we think about the immigrants, the old immigrants, the ones that arrived prior to the Civil War, what was the main areas where most of those immigrants came from? The biggest chunk of them were Irish, German. They were mostly Western European. That made up the majority of it. The new immigrants, majority of them are coming from Southern Europe and from Eastern Europe. So Southern Europe and Eastern Europe are your main geographic areas. So they're coming from a bit of a different location. These people represent different nationalities and different ethnicities than your so-called old immigrants. So you have far more Italian immigrants. They make up one of the larger chunks of immigrant groups in this period. Greek immigrants, Polish, Russian, it's much more Eastern European, Southern Europe. Think about places like Greece and that whole area. So that is more the kind of nationality that you're going to get there. Therefore, these immigrants are far less likely than your old immigrants to be English speaking. Irish immigrants, we know how much people despised the Irish immigrants in the 1830s and 40s, but they were English speaking. These people are mostly not. They speak a variety of different languages: Italian, Polish, Greek, Czech, all kinds of different things. And just overall, because of where they came from, because of their nationality, ethnicity, and culture, they seem to a lot of people to be far more culturally different than Americans. That difference in their culture and what was important to them, and the foods they ate, the clothes they wore, and the language that they spoke, to many Americans seemed much more different than, say, your old immigrants. They saw them as being much more foreign, and were much more concerned about some of that. These are also immigrants. When you think about their background and where they're coming from, many of them are coming from countries that were not at all democratic. That's not true of all of them, but they were coming from many countries that were still ruled by much more autocratic governments. Say, for example, Russia, that was still ruled by a very autocratic czar. You had much less democratic prone or democratic kinds of governments with democratic tendencies in some of these places, and so that will become a concern for a lot of Americans as well, is that these are all not democratic people, or people that don't understand democracy, and people that don't appreciate democracy and therefore can't work in that kind of a society. Irish immigrants, that was coming from a little bit more similar, kind of political system to the United States than some of these. Religiously, these immigrants, because again of where they come from, they are far more likely to be not only Catholic, which we know how Americans had felt about Catholic immigrants before. These are more likely to not only be Catholic, but you also have a lot more Jewish immigrants coming over in this group, more that were Eastern Orthodox religions that were not Protestants, that were not the mainstream Protestant religion that you more likely see, or that's far more common and far more accepted in the United States. So overall, there's a feeling that these immigrants are way different from your old immigrants. These immigrants tend to be poorer. They tend to be less educated. And again, if we think about the old immigrants, we know those were concerns then. So if that's been magnified by this point, we know that people are going to react pretty in some cases, quite negatively to that. So these newer immigrants are, again, mostly Southern and Eastern Europe. They tend to be poorer. They are just overall seen as far more different from mainstream Americans because of their language and their cultural traditions were just way different than immigrants of the old days. Now, one group that we didn't mention in that group, but we should include them, as a group that was immigrating to the United States during this time, really starting in the 1860s, is you had a significant number of Chinese immigrants coming to the United States. Now, Chinese immigration, for one thing, Chinese immigrants, in contrast to all of these Eastern and Southern European immigrants who tend to come to the East Coast, places like New York, for example, Chinese immigration is happening primarily on the West Coast. Okay, so Chinese immigrants were mainly coming to the West Coast, places like California, for example, which had high numbers of Chinese immigrants beginning in the 1860s and moving into the 1870s. Most of your Chinese immigrants tend to be men. And the thing that mostly attracted a lot of Chinese immigrants to the United States, particularly to the western part of the United States, which part of that just makes sense geographically. It would have been a lot closer for Chinese immigrants to come to the United States as West Coast. Wouldn't have made sense the other way around. But the thing that a lot of Chinese immigrants came for was the railroads, a lot of railroad jobs, and a lot of all the railroad building that we talked about last week. A lot of the physical labor provided for the building of those railroads and all that sort of thing, a lot of that physical labor was Chinese immigrants. And then also finding work doing other kinds of jobs in some Western towns, whatever kind of things they may be. And I think you could easily make the case that of all the immigrant groups, although they are, of course, all going to experience discrimination and prejudice and a lot of very ugly attitudes. Probably the most visceral racist stuff is, of course, going to be targeted at Chinese immigrants. There is, terrible racism that is thrown their way. Violent attacks, lynchings of Chinese immigrants on the West Coast, and as we will see, eventually their exclusion. We're going to talk about in just a second. So all of this, of course, leads to a reaction from Americans, native-born Americans, that probably won't surprise us. Because as I've said before, and I continue to say, one of the great ironies of this country is that we are a nation of immigrants that has never liked immigrants all that much. And just as we saw nativism, we talked about this last year. What was nativism? The what?
The pride of being like natives.
Yes, and therefore being against what?
And they're exclusionists.
Yes. Nativism as in native-born American. Now, we hear that word native, and we think American Indians. In these days, they would not have. They meant people who were born in the United States, native-born Americans, or pure Americans, as they might think. And nativism was this hostility towards immigrants, to people that weren't native-born. This feeling that native-born Americans were better, and therefore that immigrants should not be allowed certain things. And of course, there's different degrees of that, from nativists who wanted immigration to be restricted, some that wanted it outright banned, or a lot of the time what nativism represents or manifests itself as, were attempts to block immigrants from doing certain things, like keeping immigrants from running for office when they became citizens, blocking immigrants from voting and stuff like that once they gain those rights, once they've been in the United States long enough to gain such rights. They feel overall that immigration is a threat. Nativists would have seen that immigrants were some kind of either a cultural threat, that these people were going to come in and erase American traditions and erase American identity, and that they were kind of polluting it with their different culture and their different language and their different ways of doing things, even different kinds of foods. They did not accept that. They saw them even as a political threat. That goes back to what I was talking about a moment ago, with these immigrants oftentimes coming from countries that weren't democratic, or that did not have a history of democratic government, that had a history of much more autocratic governments, more dictator-like kind of governments. And there was a concern that these people couldn't assimilate into a democratic society, that they did not love democracy, and therefore wouldn't support and protect and participate in a democratic society, and that they would try to infuse their beliefs in monarchy or the czar or whatever, all kind of crazy things, that they would try to bring that and plant that into the United States, or that their religions would corrupt the United States. We know that that was a concern for Irish immigrants back in the 1840s, that people that honestly believed, and the same thing happens here, that immigration was some kind of a Catholic conspiracy, that this was the Vatican trying to take over the United States, or maybe the Eastern Orthodox Church trying to take over the United States. And these immigrants were like little, robots of the Pope doing exactly what the Pope said and all this sort of stuff. So sometimes nativism, may show up as not we don't want, immigrants to run for office. We don't want Catholics to run for office. A lot of the time it is religious in nature where that discrimination comes from. We know that as well as seeing them as a cultural threat, as a political threat, what other kind of way did a lot of Americans see immigrants as a threat? Their jobs, yeah, the huge concern that they were taking jobs, that they were driving down wages, that this was the reason why wages were low, because you have all these immigrants coming over, thousands and thousands and thousands a day, that were willing to work for lower wages, and that were willing to be used as strike breakers, and that was happening quite often. And one of the reasons why strikes are not very effective, like we talked about last week, strikes could easily be broken because you did have a large number of people that were waiting to take those jobs, many of which were immigrants, although not all of them. Concerned that these were all the poor people, that Europe is just dumping their poor people, coming over with diseases and they're criminals and they're, just not fit for American society. And it's just kind of like, dumping out the trash on America and making them take care of it. Again, you'll notice some of these arguments haven't changed all that much in 100 years. Now, again, we're going to see all of that show up in a lot of different ways, from societies forming that wanted to protect American culture, all kinds of restrictions on people running for office, attempts to block certain religions from doing certain things, from holding certain jobs, whether they be government jobs or whatever. We won't see actual limitations on the number of immigrants coming to the United States until the 20th century, with one exception, and that is the Chinese. And we see the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882. Yes.
Around the same time, like in China, isn't this around the same time the Box Rebellion, or is that like
Box Rebellion is I can't remember the exact year, but it's in this era.
So I mean, like for one thing, it's kind of ironic. They also had their own natives sort of movement.
Absolutely, yes.
But the thing is, we were actually like invading them,
Yes.
which is a bit ironic.
Yes. Yes.
But secondly, do you think that kind of added on to a bit of the sort of reactionary fervors of nativists here in the United States? It's like, oh, all these the Chinese people in China, they're like trying to kill all the Europeans.
I don't know, because maybe certainly it could have added to it, but that anti-Chinese sentiment was
Well, I know
around.
it's been around forever.
Yeah, that had been around. Now, whether or not it made it worse, I don't know. It'd be interesting to see if there was because I cannot remember exactly what year that was. That was after. I think it was after Chinese Exclusion Act. I'll have to look and see when that was. But they would have, but it'd be interesting to see if there was an increase in anti-Chinese violence or something after that. That'd be something interesting to look up. I'm not sure. The Chinese Exclusion Act does exactly what it sounds like. It banned Chinese immigration to the United States, cut it off completely. Well, there were a few exceptions. Students, for example, which there weren't that many of those. There were a few specific professions and things that might have been allowed in, but for all intents and purposes, this cuts off Chinese immigration to the United States until it is lifted some point in the 20th century. And so the Chinese become the first and the only specific nationality that has ever been totally banned from the United States as far as immigration is concerned. The only exclusion explicitly based on race and not on anything else. Now you will see again quotas and restrictions and limitations on numbers and stuff that will get imposed later. We won't see that to the 20th century, and they were quite racist, but they didn't necessarily single out particular groups and particular nationalities explicitly the way that the Chinese Exclusion Act did. So that was a much more extreme way of limiting immigration, and as we can see, quite a racist one. Now there are restrictions on immigration as far as they put restrictions on people with criminal records, convicts, people with certain diseases, all this stuff like that, mentally incompetent people. There will be literacy tests and all kinds of strict kind of some litmus tests, which you were supposed to earlier, but I got the time wrong in Google Classroom. Looking in at, that's part of what was happening in Ellis Island, all the processing, making sure people didn't have certain diseases, all that kind of stuff. But even still, most of those people were accepted and eventually allowed to enter the United States. So you will see some of that. Now, although most of the reaction, as we can see here, to immigration could be classified as being quite negative and very racist and, very, ethnocentric, there were examples, though, of people that saw immigrants as potentially very helpful to American society, or at least felt that immigrants deserved assistance, that they were people just like everybody else, and that they should be helped into improving their lives, and that they should be assisted in transitioning into American society. Those people could be good, valuable citizens, that they could be important contributors to society, and that Americans had a responsibility to kind of help them do that. And so another reaction that we will see is the settlement house movement, and this kind of sums up people that really wanted to help immigrants and saw them as people that they wanted to reach out to and assist them in assimilating to American culture. The best example of that, a leader in that settlement house movement, was a reformer named Jane Addams. Jane Addams kind of leads the charge on this. She becomes one of the most well-known of the settlement house movement leaders. She established a settlement house called Hull House. And then there were similar things in some other American cities as well. Jane Addams and other settlement house leaders, which were overwhelmingly women, that we're going to talk in a moment, how women were particularly attracted to a lot of these kinds of urbanization-inspired reforms. Settlement houses were, places for immigrants to receive a variety of services to kind of help them get on their feet. For example, English classes, so immigrants could learn to speak English. And not just speaking English, but, part of it is not just knowing a language, but understanding the culture, understanding, the kinds of just things we kind of take for granted is just the way people behave and, shaking hands and all that kind of stuff. What's customary for meeting new people? What's customary for certain social situations that differs from culture to culture? So giving them those opportunities to gain those kinds of skills, providing, childcare so that people could go work and people could try to get jobs, providing even what would now be known as, elementary education, preschool education, which in these days was far more limited than it is certainly now. And a lot of the more modern concept of preschool and early elementary grades and all that kind of stuff actually kind of starts in the settlement houses. And a lot of these women sort of pioneer the whole concept of early childhood education. So they really saw, again, immigrants as people that were, ultimately here for the right reasons. They want to contribute, but they need help, and that we should be working to help these people instead of excluding them and making sure that they can't participate in the things that America has to offer. So you'll see some of that as well. These are just a couple of political cartoons to illustrate the nativism of the time, particularly the racist attitudes, especially as it concerned Chinese immigrants. Chinese immigrants you see often depicted, very exaggerated and very in a very racist way. Here you see the Chinese Exclusion Act, and what's Uncle Sam or America doing here? Yeah, kicking them out. This, kind of points out the irony of Chinese immigration being restricted, saying that all these, it's quite racist though towards European immigrants, saying, oh, we'll take all these European immigrants with all these undesirable qualities, we don't want Chinese at all. And then this one, we see these Americans here, what are they kind of saying to the immigrant? Their hands up like this. Stop. What's kind of in the shadows behind those people though? Yeah, it's like saying, here are the people telling the immigrants, no, you can't come in here, you're not good enough. But those are people that are probably just a generation or two removed from immigration themselves, calling out that hypocrisy that these are people that, this should be letter B. I'm sorry, I didn't change that. Letter B. The hypocrisy of immigration, which we know is kind of always been around as well. Okay, so immigration, one thing, I don't think it's quite as general or simple as we might think. Urbanization is not necessarily caused by immigration. The two things, they're all kind of working together. All of this, immigration, the move towards industrialization and other kinds of factors are also creating another big change in American society, and that, of course, is urbanization. The growth of cities and a huge influx is a big urban explosion, explosive urban growth, meaning just what it sounds like, that cities are growing. New ones are popping up, places that might have been little nothing towns, in the decades prior to the Civil War are becoming big, bustling cities. And more people are moving to the cities and living in cities. Again, we won't see that transition completely switch until the 20th century, when you actually have more people living in cities than in rural areas. But we're seeing that shift begin to happen by this point, and lots of people moving out of the out of the rural areas and into the city. So the population is overall becoming far more urban, and cities are themselves transforming to look more like the more modern city, the more modern vision that we would have of what a city looks like, and offering the kinds of conveniences that we might think of and the kind of excitement that we might think of when we think about city life today, and also some of the ugly things that would come with that. Maybe some of the negative things that we wouldn't like about cities are coming with that as well. So let's talk about a few of the things that are attracting people to city life. Most of this is pretty self-explanatory and obvious. And then we'll take a look at kind of what these cities look like and some of the good things and the bad things. Obviously, one big reason why people are moving to cities is jobs, because we know that industrialization is taking place, and so there is a big market for factory jobs, and so a lot of people are moving off the farm, moving from rural areas to find work in those factories, hoping maybe to work their way up, looking for some kind of a better opportunity, just like today. A lot of people moving around to different cities for employment. But cities are also changing and more people attracted to cities because transportation is improving. When we talk about people moving to cities for jobs, that doesn't just mean the lowly factory worker who's working for little low wages. You could also be talking about that greater middle class. We talked about how the business models of the day, with companies becoming bigger, that's creating more of a middle class because it's creating more of managers and clerical jobs and accountants and people that are going to have salary positions. And transportation actually affects some of those people because that means and by transportation I mean things like streetcars, which at first would have been horse-drawn, and then eventually, as electricity starts to be introduced, and it's being introduced during this time, they'll become motorized. Streetcars, eventually subways, all that sort of thing. That's making it easier for people to commute to the cities. For people more that middle class, of course, is what I'm talking about here, not your lowly factory worker, but the guy that's a lawyer or the guy that's an accountant or the guy that works in whatever, managing some department. He can go live in his nice house in the sort of outskirt kind of neighborhood and then take the streetcar or the subway or whatever into the city to work. So that's attracting a lot of people to those areas as well. And a lot more of those middle class kind of folks were wanting to do that as the cities themselves are becoming more and more crowded with that urban poor, with the people that are the lowly factory workers, the immigrants, and all of that. A little bit other things that might have attracted, this both kind of explains partially why people might have been attracted to cities and just a way that cities are changing. We're kind of just one of the ways to describe the new modern city. I have up here skyscrapers. We know what skyscrapers are. What are skyscrapers? Big buildings, big tall buildings, okay? And why do you suppose that skyscrapers were being built in these cities?
Because they can't really
Yeah.
go outward.
You can't really go outward anymore, you gotta go up. So that one, illustrates how much cities were growing. It illustrates the, technological advancement in that with steel and all those kind of industries like we talked about, building skyscrapers was possible. But it also kind of illustrates this fascination that some people might have had with city life. How to some folks, city life just might have seemed exciting. It might have seemed interesting. There was more to do. You're starting to see this image of a modern city with skyscrapers, with electricity, with streetcars, with department stores, with theaters and entertainment. Now, again, obviously, those are things that probably would have only been really available or really, accessible to more middle to upper class people. But there was, for a lot of folks, this sense of modernness and convenience and excitement and entertainment that came from city life as well. Suspension bridges, making transportation easier as well. Now, cities are also at this time, because of urbanization and immigration, they're also becoming more segregated. You're seeing kind of more specific sections of cities, whether it be, like neighborhoods, boroughs, sections or blocks of the city that tend to be associated with particular socioeconomic groups or economic activities, things like that. As more and more factory workers, the lowly kind of factory workers that didn't make a lot of money, were moving into the cities, and as immigrants who were oftentimes poor were moving into those cities, they're becoming more crowded, they're becoming more unhealthy, they're becoming more crime-ridden in some cases. That means that those middle-class kind of folks, the wealthier people in the cities, are moving to more residential suburbs. So we're starting to see that certain parts of cities be the more affluent areas. You're seeing these more affluent areas spring up in certain parts of cities. Like, for example, in New York, your Upper East Side is kind of the fancy side. That's still where all the rich people in New York live. You know, that's becoming the area with the nice houses, the fences, the park, you know, very residential, where people that could afford to do so would live in nicer conditions, away from the noise and the filth and the crime and all of that, and then they can take the streetcar or the subway and things like that into the city for work and shopping and all that kind of stuff. So you're seeing, you know, the nicer parts and the not so nice kind of parts. Then you have those inner city areas where your urban poor are more likely to be concentrated. And those inner city areas where your urban poor is concentrated, that is where you're going to see tenements being used to house large numbers of people, and we will see those much more run down, much more crowded, much less properly funded and sort of taken care of kind of neighborhoods. So cities have the extreme. They have the nice residential neighborhoods with the manicured lawns, but then they also have these darker parts, slums, and tenements were common as a housing mechanism. Tenements were apartment buildings. They are apartment buildings that were designed to, one, be cheap, and to house as many people as you could, to stuff a lot of people into a very small space. And this is where your urban poor, this is where a lot of immigrants will end up. And you're talking, I mean, an area not even as big as this room, with, you know, a small, like, you know, like a bedroom, a sitting room, and a little small, like, toilet usually that was being shared by multiple families. But a space, like I said, not as big as this room, maybe half the size of this room, that you may have 2 or 3 families living in. There could be as many 20 people in there. Poorly ventilated, oftentimes without fresh water or plumbing. Quite not nice places to live. But that was the reality for most of your urban poor. That was the reality for most of the immigrants that we were talking about a moment ago, living in terrible conditions where it's dirty, again, it was not clean, diseases were rampant, you didn't have in those parts of the cities proper sanitation, you know, there's just garbage out in the street, you didn't have proper sewer systems, so that, you know, just exacerbates illness and ill health and all that sort of thing. So you have definitely completely, you know, it's just a different world from one side of the city to another, all of this in the same place. These images kind of give you you know, the extremes of that. Here we have one of these poorer neighborhoods. You can see you've got a dead animal laying in the street, and children just playing around it, you know, as if no big deal. And you can imagine the kind of diseases and things that are being spread because of that. But here's your, you know, nicer outskirt kind of neighborhood, maybe a couple of miles away, with the nice streets and the nice houses and all that sort of thing. Here are some of these tenements. You can see here, these are sort of the balconies, the only area they had to really get fresh air, which they're going to hang their washing and things like that. It just looks like a dilapidated old building. But then you also have places like Central Park, where you even have animals sometimes grazing in the middle of cities. So you have both extremes. So lastly, we're going to talk about some of the ways that people started trying to attack certain things that weren't so great about Gilded Age society. Certain, whether it was the problems of the urban poor, we've already mentioned actually one example, and that's the settlement houses, you know, trying to make life better for immigrants and trying to help them improve their situation. But other issues that were brought about by immigration and urbanization inspire other kinds of reforms, as well as some of the other social problems that we've talked about over the past couple of days. So let's try to look at some of the things that were being done. We're not going to mention any specific people or any specific organizations related to this one, just that it was something that was being done and that was seen as a problem, and you're seeing efforts at a lot of city and state levels to fix this, and that is overall sanitation and urban improvements. So this means people that were wanting to establish like regular garbage collection services, that wanted to establish better sewer systems and to make improvements to water and all that kind of stuff, to get running water into all kind of public buildings and that sort of stuff to clean up all that nasty mess that we just talked about. So you will see efforts to do that. Again, no, I'm not going to give you like specific people that led a big sanitation effort, but a lot of that is being done at the local level. We'll talk actually tomorrow about political machines and their role in that, and providing those kinds of service to improve some of those poorer areas. Although that remains a problem, it will certainly remain a problem, and we'll continue to see reforms in that area all the way through the progressive movement. A lot of this is actually going to foreshadow some reforms that we'll see in the progressive era that comes not too long after all of this, kind of it just getting started here. So we see some of that. Another one, though, this is one that's not new to you. We talked about this last year, but it experiences kind of a little bit of a resurrection as a result of all these problems, and that's temperance. Now, if you remember from last year, what was the temperance movement all about?
Kind of like a precursor to prohibition.
Yes, what were they? So what does that mean?
They were against drinking.
Alcohol, okay, anti-alcohol. The temperance movement was the movement to limit alcohol. And we know that was a big thing prior to the Civil War. Is actually one of your more widespread of your reform movements prior to the Civil War. But like a lot of things, it had to take a back seat eventually to the slavery issue. But then it's going to experience a resurgence and become even stronger, really, in the late 19th century for some of the same reasons. And, you know, these are people that saw drinking and alcohol abuse as a real problem, and it was. They were not wrong in that. You know, for one thing, with the vast amount of immigration, a lot of those people came from cultures that simply drank more. And with the factory work and all other kinds of problems, a lot of people turned to alcohol as a way to deal with a lot of those problems. So there was a lot of heavy drinking. They were not just a bunch of prudes, you know, running around, you know, shame on people for drinking anything. Public drunkenness was a problem, and it was a nuisance, and there was a concern that that was ruining people's lives, and that it was a cause of poverty, and it was a cause of crime, and it was a cause of disease. And like I said, they weren't necessarily wrong in that. So there were a lot of people involved in the temperance movement. We see the creation of a national temperance organization called the Women's Christian Temperance Union. That was a big women's organization to promote temperance. Once again, just as we saw temperance the first time, notice here the presence of women. Just like in the years following the Second Great Awakening, how women were particularly inspired to be involved. Women were particularly inspired to bring about change. Women felt particularly moved and felt that particularly as women, that they were well suited to bring about these changes, and they were well suited to to point out some of these problems. The same thing is happening here. A lot of the reformers of this period and a lot of these reform movements are particularly inclusive of women and involve women in a lot of ways, that felt this was an appropriate way and an important way for them to bring about effective change in a time where most of them cannot vote, and saw this as a way to make themselves heard. And that, just like in the first part of the 19th century, gives further rise to the women's suffrage movement. We're going to see that get resurrected. It never really went anywhere, but it certainly kind of took a back seat for a while. But it is about to come back up as a result of some of these same problems. What do we mean by suffrage? Right to vote. Okay, this will lead more and more women to start continuing to push for the right to vote. Some of the Western states were a little bit more liberal about that and already giving women the right to vote in some cases. But that whole movement, which again had originally started in the 1840s and such, by some of the same women that were pushing for temperance and abolition and all of that, they then look and say, what about us? And they say, how much more could we do? How much more effective could we be if we also had the vote? That's when we could really make some change. We could really help people if we had the vote. So we were seeing, and some of them the same people. They're actually some of the same women's activists, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They were all still alive at this point, and they're just resurrecting, kind of restarting. Again, not that it ever really went anywhere, but maybe perhaps re-energizing, that movement they had helped start decades earlier, and that will continue into the progressive era. But also in this time, a lot of these women actually arguing, it kind of takes on a slightly different tone. Not completely, but it is a slightly different approach to their argument. Prior to the Civil War, they use Declaration of Independence and all that kind of stuff to say men and women, or we should have the right to vote because we are the same as men. But here they're out, many of them are actually arguing we should have the right to vote because we're different from men. We should have the right to vote because we see things that they don't. We are able to, as mothers, as caregivers, you know, the fact that we are feminine, that allows us to see and to better respond to some of the problems that men are just not as good at seeing, like the problem of poor children, you know, playing in dirt in the street and they should be in school, you know, stuff like that. So it does take on a little bit of a different tone, actually arguing that it wasn't their sameness that made them well suited to be voters, but it was actually their differences, and that they should be involved for that reason. Another reform that comes up in response to a lot of these changes, urbanization, all the industrialization and all of that, is more Americans latching onto socialist principles and the formation of socialist groups and the Socialist Party in the United States. Now, this can be quite a controversial topic. I know, I heard some of you talking about it as I came in today, but I'm about to blow some of your minds. Socialism and communism are not the same thing.
Thank you.
So, there you go. So we need to understand that. Let's just know that. Socialism simply defined, and I don't want to get into a debate or an argument about it, it is simply the idea, the concept, that the government should own the means of production and businesses, that those things shouldn't be in the hands of the private market or private individuals that only want profit, but that those things like the railroads, for example, or the steel industry or whatever, and there's different versions of it, there's different extremities of it, but that those kinds of things should be owned by the government so that things are provided and services are provided not for profit, but for what's going to be good for society. That's the name socialism. So providing what's good for society, making sure that everybody has access to goods and services as opposed to just the people who can afford them, and making sure that production decisions are being made not because it's going to make this guy rich, but because that's going to mean that these services are equally provided to everyone and that there is a greater access to goods and services and more equality and purchasing power in society. Now, socialism never takes off in the United States the way that it does in a lot of European countries, but it was definitely a more notable movement at this point. It starts to get, when it starts getting associated with communism, even though those two things are not the same, socialism does not talk about a workers' revolution and violence and those kind of things that communist ideology oftentimes does. Socialism on its own is not a comment on political censorship or any of those kinds of things that communism tends to. But when that association starts to happen, obviously you'll see socialism take a pretty big hit. But people like Eugene V. Debs that we talked about last week, after the Pullman strike, he embraces socialism and he becomes a leader of the Socialist Party in the United States, and quite a powerful one, actually runs for president a couple of times on the socialist ticket. So those are just a couple of ways that people are responding to some of those reforms. Now, lastly, I want to talk specifically about a response to the racial situation in the United States. We've talked about the whole racial situation, particularly in the South, with segregation and disenfranchisement, lack of political rights, lynching, and just the complete and total lack of justice in the South. But that discrimination, economic discrimination, that was everywhere. You're going to see it probably more blatantly happening in the South, but it was truly everywhere to some degree. And so we're going to look at two particular, really three, reformers that were leaders in the African American community, but that had particularly opposite views kind of on how African Americans should work to better their situation and what they ought to be doing. One of those was Booker T. Washington, which is probably a familiar name to a lot of you. I've actually studied him before, for whatever reason, partly because Booker T. Washington is often known to us better than to a lot of students your age throughout the country, is because he's, of course, part of Alabama history. Booker T. Washington is the guy that started Tuskegee, if you don't remember. Booker T. Washington was a former slave, had been born into slavery, and then becomes an advocate for education, for African American education, thus the founding of the Tuskegee Institute, which of course is now Tuskegee University. But specifically, Booker T. Washington advocated for and created Tuskegee for a specific type of education. He advocated for industrial education, technical education. that African Americans should be working to be, have technical skills so they could be good factory workers or to be good farmers. Things that would get them a good job where they could make a good living. Because ultimately what Booker T. Washington was advocating was economic independence. And what African Americans needed was to be able to support themselves economically, to have a good job and make a living. And therefore, don't be asking for, he said, we shouldn't be working for political equality. We shouldn't be seeking the vote. We shouldn't be seeking it into segregation. Remember, he's in Tuskegee, Alabama doing all this. We should be thinking about being, good workers and having a good job and all that kind of stuff. And then white people will eventually respect us. And then they'll give us the vote later, but saying that we shouldn't be doing that right now, that it should be gradual. And if we do A, B, and C, then they will see African American people as worthy and they will eventually come around and give us the vote and all that sort of stuff. So you can imagine that Booker T. Washington, which of course the Tuskegee Institute did educate many, many people, and certain his message and his ideas helped a lot of people. But you can also see that there was a lot of room for criticism there as well. Why might some people criticize what Booker T. Washington was saying? What was he basically telling a lot of African Americans to accept? To accept racism and accept segregation, and that's just the way it is right now, and we got to work our way up to it. So he did get a great deal of criticism from that, from African American leaders and others that called him an accommodationist, a white accommodationist, saying, you're just going around saying what the white people want you to say, and they respect you and like you, but you're telling people to accept things that are wrong and to accept things that are not fair, and to accept injustice. So there's, of course, praise and criticism for Booker T. Washington. One of the big critics of Booker T. Washington, kind of the opposite of Booker T. Washington, was W.E.B. Du Bois, and that is pronounced Du Bois. Du Bois was born free, and Du Bois became the first African American to gain a PhD from Harvard. So he becomes very highly educated. Not that Booker T. Washington wasn't, which is a different kind of education. And since he himself was highly educated, PhD from Harvard no less, what kind of goals do you think he was pushing or he was suggesting African Americans seek? Higher education, professional jobs. It's not, if you want to be a factory worker, that's great. But if you want to be a lawyer, you should be able to be a lawyer. If you want to be a farmer, that's wonderful, and you should be a good farmer. But if you want to be a doctor, there shouldn't be anything stopping you from being a doctor, So W.E.B. Du Bois was saying, we shouldn't have to wait on any of this. We shouldn't have to wait on voting rights. We shouldn't have to wait on an segregation. Those are things we should be given now. And very much criticized Booker T. Washington. He's one of those that would have called him an accommodationist, that he was selling out his race, and allowing injustice to take place. You can also though make the argument that W.B. Du Bois wasn't in the South, and maybe Booker T. Washington just saw the handwriting on the wall, and knew that if he said something like that he and everybody that agreed with him, would have likely been killed for it. You can debate that as much as you like. It's a very interesting debate to have, actually. Nevertheless, W.E.B. Du Bois and several other African American leaders, intellectual leaders, eventually start in the late 19th century the NAACP, which from here on we will probably just say NAACP. You can see why they adopted that as their acronym or nickname, because the full name, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, is quite a mouthful to say. You probably heard of the NAACP before. They are still around and quite active. This is a legal organization designed to, and their mission to do just what their name suggests, to improve the situation of African Americans. Whether that be through, just promoting those issues and education. But later we'll see the NAACP more, particularly in the civil rights movement. Like I said, it's a legal organization. So a lot of those early civil rights cases, were filed by NAACP lawyers, and they were supported by NCAA funds and committees and different things like that. So we'll see them a lot more as time goes along. But it, of course, is very slow work. Very lastly, I don't have her picture up here, but another prominent African-American reformer, an example of a female African-American reformer, is Ida Wells. Among other things, Ida Wells was particularly passionate about lynching, or anti-lynching rather, and pushed very hard to get the federal government to pass anti-lynching laws, anti-lynching legislation to try to make lynching a federal crime, seeing as how states weren't doing anything about it and they were not prosecuting anybody that was suspected. They looked the other way. She was trying to get that noted as a federal crime so that it'd be out of the state's hands. It's not incredibly effective, obviously, in that time, but still a reflection of African American activism, and also for women's rights, for African American women. We talk about the irony of a lot of those women's suffrage groups we were talking about just a moment ago, is that they are almost always very exclusionary. They wanted women's suffrage and they wanted women's rights, but more accurately, they wanted women's suffrage for white women, and they wanted more inclusion for white women. So Ida Wells was trying to include African American women in some of those same things as well. The African American women, should have a voice as much as white women. And so again, many of these issues will be eventually bleed over into a movement that we'll call the progressive movement, which lasts from about 1890s to about 1920, in which we will see some change made in these regards. We'll see women's suffrage happen, as well as some changes to cities and stuff, some that will be short-lived, some that won't, but that will lead us into that. Now, another big issue that was brewing about this time, another concern for a lot of people, was expansion overseas, which is what we'll look at in the next chapter. But tomorrow, we'll look at the political situation. We'll look at how a lot of the time these issues are being tackled by social groups, because a lot of times they weren't being tackled by political parties. So we'll talk about why and how all that starts to change as well. Okay. Any questions or thoughts or